Secretary Chuck Hagel has delivered forceful remarks about China. Hagel says the country is a great power, but he urged Beijing to use its power responsibly.
With this power comes new and wider responsibilities as to how you use that power. How do you employ that military power?
Hagel spoke in Tokyo today, where there's concern over a territorial dispute with China over islands in the East China Sea. He also announced the U.S. will send 2 additional ballistic missile destroyers to Japan amid threats by North Korea. Hagel is expected to travel to China tomorrow. Communities in and around Fort Hood are trying to reestablish a sense of normalcy after an Army truck driver went on a shooting spree last week, killing 3 soldiers. NPR's Kirk Sigler reports grief counselors and mental health professionals have mobilized throughout the area.
Churches and other community centers on and off the Fort Hood post are serving as gathering areas for those still coping with last week's deadly shooting. The Department of Veterans Affairs also has dispatched mobile counseling clinics for soldiers and their families in the parking lots at 2 local Walmarts. Andrea Farmer is supervising the effort for the VA's Readjustment Counseling Service.
And we're going to be here as long as the community needs us. So we don't have right now a date of closure. As long as we're needed, we're going to be here.
The mobile centers are staffed with 6 licensed clinicians throughout the day. Farmer says they've been fairly busy since they arrived in the hours after Wednesday's shooting. Kirk Sigler, NPR News, Killeen, Texas.
In eastern Ukraine, pro-Russian demonstrators took over local government buildings in 3 cities. NPR's Ari Shapiro reports activists in Donetsk broke through a police line.
The rally in Donetsk attracted more than 1,000 people, waving Russian flags and chanting, "Donetsk is a Russian city." A group of a few dozen protesters broke off from the crowd and forced their way into a regional administrative building. Video posted online shows the men standing on a balcony, arms raised high. While western Ukraine identifies with Europe, eastern cities like Donetsk align more with Russia. Some people there say they want to follow the Crimean Peninsula, which Russia annexed from Ukraine last month. Ari Shapiro, NPR News, Kiev.
Praise from the international community is pouring into Afghanistan after yesterday's presidential election. Turnout was unexpectedly high in the face of violent threats from the Taliban. Afghanistan's interior minister says several security officials, election workers, and civilians are under arrest on charges of election fraud, but there's no indication that manipulation was widespread. Final election results will be announced in May. This is NPR News in Washington. A U.S. Navy warship has reached a stalled sailboat hundreds of miles off the Mexican coast to rescue a sick baby. 2 adults and their children were attempting to sail around the world when they issued a distress call. Coast Guard Petty Officer Barry Bina says the baby girl is heading to San Diego for medical treatment.
She was reported in stable condition. They were brought aboard, and that was after being brought aboard and had a medical screening done.
Officials say the 36-foot sailboat lost communication abilities and sent a satellite call for help on Thursday. Researchers have taken a big step, making a simple blood test that can detect lung cancer. NPR's Richard Harris reports.
Lung cancer is usually not picked up by a doctor until it has started to progress, but that could soon change. Researchers at Stanford University say they've developed a test that can pick up tiny amounts of DNA from a lung tumor in someone's blood. That test can be used to help guide treatments, and it can often pick up early-stage lung cancer in people who aren't yet feeling sick. This report in Nature Medicine is just the latest advance for a technology that may ultimately be useful to spot many different types of cancer early when they are easier to treat. Richard Harris, NPR News.
Health officials in Guinea say all passengers departing from the capital city's airport must fill out a health form and have their temperature taken. Officials say it's part of an effort to combat the spread of Ebola. The health ministry says anyone with a temperature higher than 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit will be tested for the deadly disease. I'm Windsor Johnston, NPR News in Washington.
Support for NPR comes from the
Bremerton Bar and Grill is your new neighborhood bar and grill. At Bremerton Bar and Grill, they're an American-style, family-friendly restaurant that offers spectacular outdoor dining, happy hours twice a day, 18 draft beers, award-winning menus, and fast, friendly service. Need space for a private party? Reserve the Brad Johnson Private Dining Room and dine in a real bank vault. Bremerton Bar and Grill, 190 Pacific Avenue, right across the street from the ferry terminal in downtown Bremerton. Cliff Cycle Center is an authorized full-service dealership that markets Kawasaki, KTM, Suzuki, Aprilia, Vespa, Piaggio, and Kymco scooters. At Cliff Cycle Center, you'll also find Kawasaki and Yamaha personal watercraft and Kawasaki, Polaris, and Suzuki all-terrain vehicles. At Cliff Cycle Center, they invite you to come on down and have a cup of coffee on them. They'd love to meet you at Cliff Cycle Center, 1200 Charleston Beach Road, across from the shipyard. Cliff Cycle Center.
CoinForce.com is your headquarters for superior quality challenge coins, proudly serving military and non-military customers worldwide. Located near the main gate of McChord Air Force Base and close to Fort Lewis, CoinForce.com is owned and operated by retired military veterans. CoinForce.com understands your needs and are proud to continue serving the military community in our own special way. For an undisputed best value, extreme quality, and superior customer service, when you're looking for the world's largest selection of challenge coins, visit CoinForce.com, owned and operated by retired military veterans.
Getting married, entertaining clients, or maybe you're just having a bash with your friends. No matter the occasion, make sure you plug into the tunes with E&M Entertainment. There are tons of DJs out there, but how many of them want to get to know you beforehand so they can play your soundtrack at your event at your kind of price? It's more than just a great selection. E&M plays your great selection, and that makes all the difference. So call 425-971-8078. That's 425-971-8078 for E&M Entertainment.
From Silverdale or Bremerton, Washington, this is the Field of Steve webcast. Or, in your case, it may be the podcast, depending on when you're listening to it. This is the show that takes your Sunday afternoon and makes you wonder how you could have wasted your weekend like this. My name is Stephen Gardner. I am the host. This is episode, I don't know what. At any rate, this is one of the live episodes that I've begun doing here on EdgeMediaSource.com. That began February 23rd. But as is true in most cases, most of these episodes have been pre-recorded, primarily because I've been working on the weekends. In this case, however, I happen to be in Cincinnati as this first broadcast. My work has allowed me to go to Cincinnati to engage in some leadership training. And I'm excited about that, as much fun as I might make of myself, as self-deprecating as I might be. I get to experience some outdoor training, dealing with leadership. A lot of it is outdoors at any rate. And this is something I've experienced before and on one level, even facilitated some of it for a while. And so I'm pretty psyched. And on Friday I get to go to a Cincinnati Reds game, so that makes it an even better opportunity for me, an even better trip. So for this weekend, what I am deciding to do, as this last week was amazingly busy, and I've still got a lot to do. It's Friday night, and when I pre-record these things, I get the recordings to Kevin Chambers on Saturday so that he can get them ready, and we can just air them on Sunday. When I do that, I of course have to pre-record something earlier in the week, and it is now late Friday night. And fortunately, I have a backlog of material that if you're listening to this live on Edge Media Source, you probably haven't heard this before unless you've gone through the catalog of the Field of Steve podcast, which, why would you do that? I'm going to present 4 episodes in one show. These were episodes that took place in October 2011, and they all dealt with conspiracy theory. I had come across, I had the opportunity to write something on a particular subject, and as you are introduced to this first story that takes place as part of the 4 episodes, you'll see what that story was about, but it dealt with conspiracy and conspiracy theories. And it was one of the more enjoyable months of my 2011 podcast career, and I also was able to speak with Ingrid Walker, who's an associate professor of 20th and 21st Century American Studies and Popular and Political Culture at the University of Washington at Tacoma. Early in her career, she dabbled quite a bit in conspiracy theory, looking at it as a form of literature. And my conversation with her, that makes up the middle half of the program, my conversation with her was fascinating to me, and it's something that I would like to do more of on as the Field of Steve progresses. It was quite unusual at the time. So, without much left to say, I would just say that thanks to the folks at Edge Media Source who allow me to webcast here. To hear the show later in the week, go to fieldofsteve.com, and I'll have this posted as a podcast. And you can subscribe to the podcast via iTunes. Again, the name of it is Field of Steve. Thanks again for listening, and enjoy a little conversation about conspiracies. Again, to set the stage for this particular podcast, for this particular show, this show begins with a recording that I heard as I was researching conspiracy. There was a reason I got into conspiracy, and as I mentioned before, you'll find out what that is. But as I was doing that, as I was doing some research, I found this particular speech that dealt with the particular topic I was looking into. I think you'll find it enjoyable, perhaps amazing, and if it's something that you agree with, perhaps you and I need to talk. At any rate, enjoy this episode on conspiracy.
I've had people calling me saying they go out to their mailbox and they find a little red dot or a little blue dot on their mailbox, and they wonder what the little red dot and blue dot is. Well, it's marking your mailbox by the government, so when foreign troops come in here on us after martial law, if you have a red dot on your mailbox, they take you out immediately and shoot you right in the head. But if you have a blue dot, they take you to the FEMA camps being built by Halliburton right now to house 50 million Americans. They're building enough concentration camps in America by Halliburton that Cheney's getting rich off of, Vice President Cheney's getting rich off of, to put those with the blue dot on your mailbox in those concentration camps. Now, if you go out and you find a pink dot on your mailbox, that means that they believe you'll be a good slave and you're going to go along with the program and serve our international Antichrist masters. So watch for that dot. They haven't got up to our area yet because they're afraid we might catch them putting the dots on the mailbox and they wouldn't get back to their home at night, if we catch them.
That clip was a short piece from a speech by Jack McLam, a former Phoenix police officer, whose website says he was injured on duty apprehending a convicted drug smuggler. That injury led to his medical retirement. The site also says he's a military veteran, a hostage negotiator for the FBI, and has a radio show on the Genesis Communications Network. In preparing for this podcast, I attempted to reach McLam to see if he would be interviewed. I received no response. I don't disclose that to make him look bad. I just want to make clear I extended an opportunity to Mr. McLam to make the same case you heard earlier. I heard this speech, which was given in the months before the 2008 presidential election, because of a freelance writing assignment I took on. My job was to answer the question, why there are dots on some individuals' mailboxes. It is not uncommon for a writer to refer to Google nowadays to at least see what theories are out there. The notion that the dots were there to mark who would be killed, camped, or left alone was the predominant answer. Now, there were many people who scoffed at the idea, but few offered alternatives. I found a video of McLam's explanation. Here's the more complete version, a recording that includes what we heard before.
I have a good buddy at one time, J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI. He was not a homosexual like they say. That was a lie that they built up to discredit him. Here's what he said 40 years ago. He said the individual is handicapped by coming face to face with a conspiracy so monstrous that he cannot believe it even exists. And that's the problem we have today. This conspiracy is so monstrous, so conspiracy so monstrous that people don't even believe it exists. And that's the problem we have today, folks, is doing that, convincing people that this conspiracy is real. But praise God, we have all the evidence needed to prove to anybody, if they'll just look at the evidence, that 9/11 was an inside job, right? I want to tell you that there are red and blue lists out there. Some of you already heard about the red and blue list, okay? And some people are calling my radio talk show on Genesis Communication Network and on the Great Republic Broadcasting Network. And praise God, we got the owner of Republic Broadcasting Network. He's going to speak right after me, John, wonderful, patriotic American. But anyway, I've had people calling me saying they go out to their mailbox and they find a little red dot or a little blue dot on their mailbox, and they wonder what the little red dot and blue dot is. Well, it's marking your mailbox by the government, so when foreign troops come in here on us after martial law, if you have a red dot on your mailbox, they take you out immediately and shoot you right in the head. But if you have a blue dot, they take you to the FEMA camps being built by Halliburton right now to house 50 million Americans. They're building enough concentration camps in America by Halliburton that Cheney's getting rich off of, Vice President Cheney's getting rich off of, to put those with the blue dot on your mailbox in those concentration camps. Now, if you go out and you find a pink dot on your mailbox, that means that they believe you'll be a good slave and you're going to go along with the program and serve our international Antichrist masters. So watch for that dot. They haven't got up to our area yet because they're afraid we might catch them putting the dots on the mailbox and they wouldn't get back to their home at night, if we catch them. But it's time to prepare, folks. It's time to prepare. It's time to work like we're going to win, which we are, but it's also time to prepare like you may lose temporarily. So I'm going to tell all of you, if you have not bought ammunition, if you have not bought guns, go get them now. Go get them now, because you won't be able to get them much longer.
I continued to search, fairly well assured there would be a less deadly explanation out there. It became especially important to me because I decided to look closely at my own mailbox, and there it was, a nickel-sized reflective red dot. I couldn't remember at the time if that meant I was going hunting or camping, but I knew it wasn't good. A few pages into the message board of one of the sites discussing the dots, a more reassuring answer was offered. The Huntsville Times in Huntsville, Alabama, wrote that the stickers are, quote, used by the Huntsville Times carriers to identify the type of newspaper delivery the household receives. In most cases, yellow is every day, green is weekend, and red is Sunday only. I work for a newspaper, and I didn't know they did this. I drove around areas in our county, and I found dots on some of the mailboxes. I saw a man standing in his driveway at a home where the mailbox was dotted, and I pulled in to ask him about it. He said he was given the newspaper explanation. The next week at work, I asked our circulation director if our company buys mailbox dots. We do, he answered, saying that some were for daily delivery, some to show who gets the TV booklet every week, and other reasons. The reflective dots are especially useful in rural areas, so a carrier, especially if it's a substitute, can easily see who gets what. The dots are called hot dots and come in several colors. Even though newspaper circulation is down generally, the use of the dots is far more pervasive now because most papers are delivered in the dead of night. The process of digging through a conspiracy and poking a hole in it was a lot of fun, but having watched the shelf life of other conspiracies over the past several years, I came to realize that my explanation wouldn't satisfy some people. Once even Donald Trump concluded Obama probably was born in Hawaii, he started questioning his college degree. Others, even if they conceded he was born in the U.S., questioned whether he fit the description of natural-born citizen. I watched a film, a documentary about 9/11, and the filmmakers made a very convincing case that the attacks were likely an organized effort done from the inside. They highlighted shadows on the planes, the downward trajectory of the buildings as they fell, and the absence of evidence in Pennsylvania and at the Pentagon to make the case that someone was hiding something. It was, as I said before, very convincing. And in the end, I still continue to believe that 9/11 was orchestrated by Osama bin Laden. One of the reasons I continue to believe that is because one movie isn't going to sway me. Another, though, is some of those accused of taking part in organizing the attacks, particularly the Bush White House, were reported by Richard Clarke to have been wishing for any possible link between the attacks and Iraq, and they couldn't find any. They thought they might have at one point, but it turned out to be a bad lead. So my question was, why would someone who wants an excuse to go to war with Iraq orchestrate a calamity and then forget the important part of offering some evidence that Iraq did it? My grandmother, the nutty one, my mom's mom, believed all the whoppers about JFK's assassination. She believed he wasn't killed, that the body in that casket going to Arlington was Officer Tippit, who had been killed later by Oswald. JFK was off somewhere else. Where? I don't know. I was young and was off somewhere else when I could be. In looking at all these conspiracies, I began to wonder why some conspiracies are held as true with so much conviction. So I consulted an academic. She's Ingrid Walker from the University of Washington. The interview begins with how Walker became interested in conspiracy theories.
It's actually a very funny story. So when I was in graduate school and I was in a PhD program, but I hadn't quite hit on my topic yet, and one day I came home from campus teaching, and my housemate was watching this movie he'd gotten from the library, and it was all about JFK's assassination. I sat down kind of first third into it. And it was very compelling, and it was told from the Navy corpsman's point of view at what had happened. And this has been recounted. Now I realize it's recounted in just about every JFK conspiracy theory, but I didn't know any of them then. And I was so following along, and they kept presenting pieces of evidence, and I was like, yeah. And then it got to the point where Johnson, after he was sworn in, went to the desert and signed a pact with space aliens. And that was right about the time I went, oh, no. Like, you had me until right then.
So they had you hooked until they got to the aliens.
Right, but what interested me, so what piqued my interest in this is how compelling a story that was, as I was a literature scholar, and I thought, this is really a compelling story for him, if I was that suckered into it, you know. And so I started looking into conspiracy theories, and this was the late 80s, early 90s, and there were plenty of them, and I was living in the Bay Area, and in Berkeley there are all kinds of foil hat-wearing people doing radio shows. It was like, there's lots of fodder.
So it started out of that JFK documentary, though?
It did. My interest in just why that's such a compelling story for him. And, you know, I think for me that's, I see conspiracy, we call it conspiracy theory, but I think of it as a form of story that people tell to make sense of the world. And that's why 9/11, I think, is such a compelling subject, because it's something that most of us are having a really hard time making sense of. And, you know, so it's a way, it's when you articulate, I guess the film you saw, when they put together those pieces of evidence and somebody articulates a theory, a conspiracy theory, it's a speech act, and it's a way of making sense of the world through a particular story. And that has political dynamics, and that's what I'm very interested in and went on to write about. Like, what does it mean when we say, you know, that there's a conspiracy out there and they are doing this thing?
It sounds to me like what you're saying is that people do need, or, you know, they need to make sense of something. Why do they need to go to theories like, as far as like the ones you talked about, like Johnson meeting with aliens and things like that? Why would they go that far?
That's a really good question, because I think most good conspiracy theories will, you know, like you said, you're along for the ride maybe for 45% of it. You're like, yeah, I'm with you. And then they say something that you think, oh, well, no, I'm not really buying that. And I mean, I think there are two really critical components. One is it's a theory, and they're largely unprovable. And so there's that piece. And so people can kind of start pulling in all different kinds of things. And there's a Richard Hofstadter, who's a political theorist, wrote a book in the 1950s called The Paranoid Style of politics, and it was just all about this style. And I kind of take it one step further, and I think that we need them because there's a logic to a story about a conspiracy, and that is that, that we want to believe that events are planned or orchestrated by somebody. We want to think somebody's in control of something, because otherwise it's chaos, right? And so I think that most of us, one way or another, believe that most of the time somebody is planning or aware of or in control of something. And conspiracy theorists take it one more step, and they want to believe that some group is responsible for the way that things are. And I think there's a strange comfort in that notion for conspiracy theorists. But the irony of the conspiracy theory is that if you've stumbled upon this as the conspiracy theorist and you start noticing these elements and you put the evidence together, what you're pointing out is that you are not in the know. I mean, you're finding out about it, but you are not part of the original conspiracy. And so by virtue of articulating conspiracy, you're pointing out that there are people over there and they are in control and you are not. And so it's a very weirdly disempowering kind of narrative. So I don't know why people need them so desperately, because by virtue of saying them, we're saying we don't have control over what's going on. Maybe that is comforting.
Well, I'm curious in that context, what believe that people are in control and have planned these things. 9/11 was not necessarily it was chaotic, but it was also very planned. And the storyline that we most commonly believe is that it was planned by Osama bin Laden and people under him. Why do people need to believe that somehow our government was complicit?
Well, and most conspiracy theories are about something giant like that, like the American government or big corporations. And I think people want to believe that there's something nefarious going on. They automatically just exhibit a level of distrust of government and or corporate power, and maybe for good reasons. We've had certainly we had enough evidence along the way, historically that most of us would agree upon that maybe we shouldn't entirely trust government. But I, for one, find it really almost humorous that people think that governments can collude and do these kinds of largely orchestrated things. I'm thinking they can't even get, Social Security payments, right? I mean, do you really think they have this kind of control and power? That's a really good point, though. I mean, we really do have a narrative about 9/11 that's pretty solid. It's like, there were some people who planned this, and they very particularly took on certain kinds of training and planning routes, and it was all orchestrated. So why is that not enough? And I think it's not enough because we don't trust that because we don't have information that we know what's going on. And that's a really scary place to be in a culture where we spend so much time watching and reading what's going on from a distance.
So there you have the first part of the conspiracy theory quadrophenia that I did in 2011. Some of you are probably hating me right now, but I just ask you that you continue to listen to the conversation with Ingrid Walker. And when we return, more of that will continue, and the entire story is capped by one more story. So when we come back, more with Ingrid Walker. Thank you for joining us here at Field of Steve.
Bremerton Bar and Grill is your new neighborhood bar and grill. At Bremerton Bar and Grill, they're an American-style, family-friendly restaurant that offers spectacular outdoor dining, happy hours twice a day, 18 draft beers, award-winning menus, and fast, friendly service. Need space for a private party? Reserve the Brad Johnson private dining room and dine in a real bank vault. Bremerton Bar and Grill, 190 Pacific Avenue, right across the street from the ferry terminal in downtown Bremerton.
Heather Madden, former machinist, wins success as a skilled professional rock star.
No more working dusty old machine shops for me. Being the boss of my own professional rock band has improved my life in every way, and I owe it all to the cool gear at Kitsap Music.
What do you want? Substantial spare time? Groupies? Leather pants? Use only certified cool products from Kitsap Music.
The Home Buyers Association of Kitsap County is an association of professional builders, subcontractors, service providers, and purveyors representing the home building industry. For more than 50 years, the Home Builders Association of Kitsap County has provided information, education, and services that promote the health and welfare of the home building industry. As leaders of the industry, the Home Builders Association of Kitsap County fosters safe, affordable housing and addresses issues affecting our industry. To find out more, visit them online at kitsap.hba.com.
Coinforce.com is your headquarters for superior quality challenge coins, proudly serving military and non-military customers worldwide. Located near the main gate of McCord Air Force Base and close to Fort Lewis, Coinforce.com is owned and operated by retired military veterans. Coinforce.com understands your needs and are proud to continue serving the military community in our own special way. For an undisputed best value, extreme quality, and superior customer service, when you're looking for the world's largest selection of challenge coins, visit Coinforce.com, owned and operated by retired military veterans.
Did you know volunteering with the Bremerton Central Lions Club can be fun? Community services for everyone. Young people, families, men, women. As a volunteer, you'll help your community and gain valuable skills, network with others, energize your life, make an impact, and have fun. Get in step with your community and volunteer. Visit us at bremertoncentralwa.lionwap.org.
Welcome back to Field of Steve, the show that is giving conspiracy theory a new orifice. Actually, there's probably very little I can do from a little studio in Bremerton, Washington, to dissuade people away from the conspiracies that they believe in. But here's what I've come to believe over time in doing the work that I do. As some of you know, I'm a reporter for the Kitsap Sun newspaper in Bremerton, Washington. It's clear that there are orchestrated events at times. But in reality, most things that we experience, especially on the larger scale, the most things that are carried out are the result not only of some planning, but also of some incredible accidents and strokes of luck. If you start with 9/11, there are a lot of folks out there, and I believe that some of the conversation I'll have and continue here with Ingrid Walker goes into some of the theories about 9/11, about it being an inside job and that. And there is still a man who makes a point to get out there and discuss the ways that 9/11 may have been orchestrated from the inside, from within the United States, from U.S. government officials, and not Al-Qaeda, even though all the evidence points to Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, to carry out what they had to do, they had to get some things exactly right, and or some things exactly right, but not everything. There were originally 19 or 20 people that were supposed to be flying that day, and all but one managed to do so. There were a lot of things that could have gone wrong for them, but a lot of things went right that day. Mostly for Al-Qaeda, the things that went right was our own ability to connect the dots, our own inability for agencies to speak to each other. And it's interesting that years later, we're still seeing evidence that agencies won't speak to each other here in the United States. So the idea that we're going to be able to prevent attacks, even with all of the surveillance and intrusive and controversial surveillance we're carrying out, it seems impossible to think that we won't be targeted again. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news there, or a doomsayer, but it just seems unlikely that we can prevent it 100% ever. All that said, you look back at the Kennedy assassination, look at other things. What are some of the other big conspiracies? You know, Oklahoma City, things that were considered to be conspiracies. Waco, even the IRS targeting of conservatives. A lot of things feed the narrative that make a conspiracy attractive. Most recently, we've had the incident with the Malaysian Airlines. Now, it's obvious. It's clearly forgivable for any of us to believe that there might have been some onboard terrorism that took that plane down, made it disappear. That is completely within the realm of possibility. But in the end, by all appearances, it looks like that plane had an incident and went into the water. I hope, for all of our sakes, that one day we find that plane and searchers are able to find the black box so that we can find out what happened there. Number one, if there was a conspiracy, if it was taken down by terrorists, it would be good to know that. That will help us defend ourselves in the future. And also, if there were just mechanical issues, we can help prepare for those as well. During this segment, we're going to conclude the conversation with Ingrid Walker. And I have one final story that was part of the conspiracy theory a set of podcasts, and I'm going to save that for the next half hour. So over the next few minutes, you'll listen to the rest of my conversation with Ingrid Walker, and then we will carry on.
There are a lot of people on the left who believe that 9/11 was an inside job. There are a fair number on the right as well. With the Barack Obama thing, the birther thing, the birther movement, that is most primarily from the right. And I think most of us could say, well, this is why they believe this, why they believe he was not born in the U.S. And now, the narrative has seemed to change to, well, maybe he was born in Hawaii, but he's not a natural-born citizen because of this and this and this. And so, in other words, no matter how much evidence you give somebody, it's not going to be enough.
Right, they'll persist, and I think that's actually the really critical linchpin of conspiracy theories. I see conspiracy theory as an epistemology, a way of evoking the question: how do we know what we know? What evidence is good evidence, and what is just baloney being, projected, fed to, leaked to the press? And so I think a lot of conspiracy theorists, distrust major news sources, major resources for information, and they like to find arcane, strange things around the edges, which is why a lot of these stories have bizarre elements, like Johnson making a pact with the space aliens. Because they start looking for logic in places where maybe there isn't any, and finding these sort of extraneous bits and pieces of information and trying to fit them into that hole that they're trying to create, that whole story. And it makes sense that very intelligent people, tragically, it makes sense that very intelligent people would also really be prone to conspiracy theory, because I think if you're paying attention right now, you have to know that our resources are all highly malleable and corruptible. And, so I have a teenager, and we talk a lot about the value of resources he finds in various places on the web. It's like, well, is that a peer-reviewed journal? Did somebody else look at that thing before it got published? And what do we call valid information? And so I think if you're intelligent, you distrust information that's coming, from various sources too. And I think that's why conspiracy theorists bloom, in areas of people who really probably ought to know better, but they start distrusting what they're getting through the normal news feed. I'm going to take one of my favorite contemporary conspiracy theories is that we're all being tracked and followed, right? Whether we're on the web, or every click we make, or carrying on your cell phone. And of course we are, right? We know that. And we know that there are these little devices that in malls and things like that, that if you have your that function turned on your cell phone, you walk through, you can start paying attention to what stores you're going into. Like there are people who are very interested in collecting information on us. What's fascinating is the conspiracy theories didn't used to be so much that corporations are doing that, and of course that is who's doing it. Businesses want to know, where are we looking, where are we spending our time, so they can advertise there and capitalize literally on that. But the theories go to the fact that government is doing this, and government is trying to track us, and you're going to be tracked for this reason, and they're going to know where you are. And I used to think to myself, how many of us are doing such nefarious things that we don't want people to know where we are? I don't know. I don't really have that libertarian streak exactly that says I don't want anybody to know anything about me, but at the same time, I don't particularly want to be tracked in every move I make. And so I think that's a really good example of people's paranoia, it has come true there. But what's interesting to me is that rather than trying to find out really who's tracking what information about us for what purposes, it's more comfortable, to kind of default to certain kinds of narratives that we know. And so how you tell if something's, true or not, my experience talking to conspiracy theorists, and I did more field work than I probably would have liked to, and I was writing about this all the time, and I would meet with people and talk to them, and that was always an experience because getting them to trust me before there was the web and they could see information about me,
right?
Was always tricky and earning their trust. And actually, I have to tell you, it was really funny when you contacted me. I haven't written about conspiracy in probably 15 years, so my first thought was, who is this guy and why does he want to know about conspiracy? I got all paranoid. It was really funny. I thought that's classic. But then I looked into you, and okay, he is a legitimate reporter. He does right things, and there you go. And I think if people would make that first or second attempt to find information, they may or may not be able to legitimize a conspiracy theory and see whether it's true. But I think most conspiracy theories carry a kernel of truth, but also they usually overplay their hand by trying to connect all the dots in a complete logic. And my experience is the world isn't usually operating at that level of complete logic. That for me is when I start to know, things. Okay, every little thing hooks together, and then he was a Freemason, and then this and this and this, and then you think, okay, wait a minute, and because when you make an argument, when you write as a researcher and you research something, you make an argument, there are always holes and things you can't substantiate, and conspiracy theorists tend to fill those in.
When you look at Oliver Stone creating JFK,
right?
Which was a huge conspiracy film, but very convincing. And I'll be honest with you, I wasn't convinced for years necessarily that the CIA or the government had something to do with it, but I was convinced for a long time that Oswald did not act alone. And it's still hard for me to accept sometimes that he did. And so this gets to the point that you made, is that sometimes there are kernels of truth. And I'm not saying he didn't act alone. Right. But you maybe, and in fact, more recently, it seems pretty clear that, he was the only guy doing anything that day. Right. But that was hard for me to accept.
Right. And and I feel the same way about that, actually, and I've read more than I ever want to about the Kennedy assassination. And I actually thought Oliver Stone's film was really interesting because, for me, I set it aside alongside a novel by Don DeLillo called Libra. And they're very similar. In fact, Libra came out first, and for the longest time I thought Oliver Stone had just ripped off that plot. But then I started to realize, no, he was really, I looked into more detail, and he was just playing off of documents that are out there, and especially Garrison's story.
Right.
But Libra does this really interesting thing, which I think is probably far more plausible. And so it's the same thing. You're following, it's multi-part narrative, and so one part you're following Oswald around in his little world, and another part you're following the CIA agent around in his world. He's kind of a disenfranchised CIA agent. They're kind of slowly, freezing him out from operations, and because of that, he starts just kind of acting more and more as a rogue element or autonomously, making his own decisions and doing things. And it turns out that he's the one that kind of finds Oswald and pulls him into this crazy scheme. And pretty soon, it's all these different people who are acting in a certain direction and want something to happen. All their desires kind of align in an interesting moment, and that's what brings about what is really in the novel a conspiracy, but not nearly as intentional and fully planned, because it turns out Oswald doesn't really know exactly what it is he's doing, and they kind of play him as a patsy, but then not all the other guys know what's going on either, and everybody has some information but not all the information. And I like that portrayal of any conspiracy because it strikes me as probably far more accurate. And going back to 9/11, I think that one of the things that we found out after the fact, at least we think that we found out after the fact, is how poor communication was among intelligence agencies in the United States, from the FBI, CIA, all these different groups, the State Department. They were supposed to be gathering intelligence. They weren't communicating at all. And I was listening to somebody on NPR say the other day that, in the wake of that, there were these attempts to make much more open communication, but people have thwarted it by just adding various levels of confidentiality to documents. So basically, they're still hiding everything. They're redacting and hiding everything from everybody by just saying it's classified.
My question has always been, if this is true, how come one person hasn't come forward and said, yeah, you're onto us, this is exactly what happened? Why isn't there some rogue person who was associated with JFK or with 9/11 within the government who can step forward and say, yeah, we did this, and they don't all get assassinated first.
Right, I know. Well, whistleblowers have come forward effectively in the history of the United States, so it can happen.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it happens for far, I mean, yeah, sure, there's danger involved, but come on. I mean, somebody would right now be willing to fess up that they planted explosives in the World Trade Center, it would seem to me. And nobody's done that. And, and sometimes, I don't know, are there just sometimes that we have to realize that, well, I think you asked this question, how much can we really know? I mean, how much, what did you say? How much do we know what we know, or how much do we really know?
Yeah, how do we know? So epistemology has all these questions about how do we know what we know? How do we know that is true? How do we know what knowledge is? And it's a philosophical, it's a branch of philosophy, but I think conspiracy is one of these great epistemological questions. Like, how do we know what we know? Usually it's somebody finding some weird pattern and projecting more of a pattern or connecting the dots. And I thought that was so funny that you wrote to me about dots. I'm like, you didn't realize how ironic this is because it's all about connecting the dots, right? And yet, is it? I often think that conspiracy really bloomed in the United States as such a narrative form in the 60s, 70s, and 80s just because of cultural, political things going on, but also because of the Cold War. And it was just, you've got all these people going around and sneaking around and trying to, gather information, and everything from Alger Hiss and, hiding microfiche in pumpkins. It's just so ridiculous, to all the weird CIA attempts to take out Castro, right? Exploding cigars and something that would make his beard fall off. You're just like, and these are the things that we know are accurate. And you think, okay, well, if those things are true, it's not much of a stretch, right, to go take those other few steps.
So you got into it, but you haven't been dealing with it much for 15 years, you say?
No, I wrote about it for quite a while, and then, as a researcher, I'm working on a whole different project now. But I will tell you that I think for me it saw its apex and nadir during the X-Files era.
Oh, sure.
Which was such an interesting set of spins on what is conspiracy, because you had, Scully, who is the scientific rationalist, and you got Mulder, who's, operating completely on faith and belief. And by the end of that, I don't know if you watched that series, but if you did, by the end of it, they had switched positions for a key point, for quite a while, where Mulder lost his faith and started behaving only rationally, and Scully was abducted and she started believing it, and they trade places, and it was just crazy. And the more I watched it and read about it, I realized, this is kind of this meta commentary on this desire to make sense of the world. And I think that show did such a nice job of kind of plotting all the different points, because at some point it is an art form, but it requires something, and what it requires is a kind of faith. And it requires a faith that there is logic in the world, and that things do operate, with causality and accountability, and that there's somebody accountable for everything that's happening. There's a really interesting Canadian scholar. His name is Ben Berkovich. He was named for Sacco and Vanzetti, so he has this kind of great pink diaper baby heritage. And he writes about this form, a really critical form of American storytelling, the Jeremiad, our puritanical roots. This is kind of a form of sermon. And there's a certain logic to the Jeremiad, and he points out that it's really intrinsic to all of our political acts, our major political acts all the way through the late 20th century. It was the last time he wrote about this. And I find it a very compelling argument, and I actually think that conspiracy is a version of that. And so when you start watching like presidential speeches or big moments, in fact, there's going to be one tonight, I tend to hear people making these moves and these rhetorical moves, because we've come to expect a certain kind of story to be told to us. And one of Berkovich's really interesting points is that we, as a democracy, did this really interesting thing where we took dissent and we valorized it. We made it okay to dissent, right? So the very first, our very first right is the right of free speech. We can dissent, but what that does is contain dissent. So basically, I think we all have this I have a very idealistic notion that, hey, there's a war, I don't like it, I get out there, enough people get out there and say they don't like it, it will stop. Well, 10 years later, that's been proven not true. And so there's a kind of containment of dissent in our culture, and so it makes sense that conspiracy theory would start to be the narrative form that would bloom in that environment.
Because we're exercising what the right we have to make sense of something, and the rights that we have don't cause the movement that we want, and so we kind of crave something that goes beyond. I don't want to say the truth, because like we said, there's kernels of truth in this, but we need something that actually causes something to happen?
I kind of think that's one of the motivations behind it. I think that's a really nice way of saying it. But I also think there's a kind of despair. I'm very cynical about conspiracy theory, and I think there's a kind of despair in articulating conspiracy theory, because what you're basically saying is there's an us and there's a them, and they are the ones with the power, and we don't have it. And we don't even know that they're exercising it against us most of the time. And that's really, kind of a depressing place to be. Lack of agency in your life.
Well, I mean, and so I raise the V word. Is it, do we need to be victims?
Well, I don't, and that's the irony, right? Is conspiracy theorists think they're doing something by pointing out the conspiracy. They're like, hey, there's actually this really kind of hokey, wonderful movie, and Mel Gibson is the protagonist. I think it was in the 90s, and it's called Conspiracy Theory. And he's the good guy because he's the victim, but he's also trying to point out that there is a conspiracy, and it's being perpetuated upon his body, and he's being thrashed and drugged and kidnapped and beaten. But ultimately, it turns out, that there really are black helicopters, and this is not because he looks like a crackpot through the whole movie, and then it turns out, oh, it's actually true, which is the fantasy that you look like a crackpot, but it's actually true. So that conspiracy theorists to the average person walking by on the street, and there's some nut standing on a box, shouting about end times and this, that, and the other thing, and the CIA, and wrapping it all up into a conspiracy theory. Most people just kind of shrug and move on. But I think there's a fantasy that he's not the victim; he's the seer and the truth teller.
The music you just heard there was from Zero Project. It was music that I found as I created the first year's worth of podcasts. Going to sites called like Jamendo.com and archive.net, I believe, would find this music. At any rate, that music seemed to fit very well with the subject at hand. And when we come back in the next segment, which isn't going to be for several minutes, I got a few things we can talk about over the next 6 or 7 minutes or so. But when we come back in the next segment, I'm going to tell a story that really, on its face, has nothing to do with conspiracy, other than it illustrates a point that I think is an important one to make about conspiracy theories. And this gets into Ingrid Walker's. If you listen to the conversation that I just had with Ingrid Walker, you will hear a lot of that, or you will come to the conclusion. You can find the conclusion within that conversation, and that has, to me, there are a few issues with conspiracies that cause me trouble, and I don't want to suggest that people cannot conspire to make things happen, but there are a few questions I always want to have answered, and the first one is, to what end? Why? Why, for example, would the U.S. government want to orchestrate a calamity like 9/11? I don't know that question's ever been answered for me. Why it would be an inside job, unless we're going to motivations that were inherent in books like 1984. In other words, if your government continues to be at war, then you always have an enemy, and it distracts you from the problems within the government. And I suppose that is a viable activity that a government can engage itself in creating wars, so that you're not paying attention to the real problems. We do have issues in this country that we can name ad infinitum. Liberals and conservatives both can find issues that are problems, but if we remain at war, those seem to take precedence, or they can take precedence. Now, the problem, they can take precedence, like I said, but they don't always. It's not a given, and we in this country seem to have gone through some war fatigue that basically came about because of Iraq and because of our lingering presence in Afghanistan, and even in the possibility, or even when people entertain the possibility of going into places like Syria and Egypt, or even Venezuela, if that ever comes up as a topic of conversation, and who am I to say that it won't? There's a fatigue about it, and other issues have taken precedence over the wars we're fighting. And part of that is because it's just not popular for our government to beat the drum for the wars like we did, like you can when a battle or a war is just beginning. There was plenty of drum beating in the lead up to our involvement in Afghanistan post 9/11, and then later in our involvement in Iraq post 9/11, post Afghanistan. But in both cases, it would seem that America has grown tired of it. So while 9/11 might have ushered in, if you're a conspiracy theorist, you might look at 9/11 and say, well, it did exactly what it was intended to do. And I'd be interested in hearing your theories on that. Anyone can contact me at stephen@thenarrativearts.com, or go to my blog at fieldofsteve.com, click on the blog button, and post a comment there on any of the stories, any of the blog posts that I've posted there. Or you can message me on Facebook. Like my page, Field of Steve page, and look for me, friend me on Facebook if you like, and ask me whatever question you like, or present to me any evidence that you like, that either that 9/11 is an inside job, or there is some other conspiracy that I am probably predisposed to call into question. Feel free to send me whatever evidence you might have that I am mistaken in doing that. The question, like I said, though, as always for me, is who benefits. And this is why, in my own prejudice, in my own biases, and I use those words on purpose because I tend to come from a basic space of asking the question of who benefits. And the biggest benefit that I see, the most tangible benefit I see, is when somebody stands to make money from the way something is played out. And so I am more skeptical of claims made by those who have a vested interest, those who have a financial interest in seeing a certain outcome. And if you want to call that into question, I would just point out that I would ask you how much you trust advertising. If you trust it implicitly, I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that you're not getting the whole story when you watch an ad. And the reason they won't give you the whole story, there is a conspiracy of sorts in place to withhold that story from you. They want to present you exactly the information you need to believe what they need you to believe so that you will go spend money on their product. That is a conspiracy. And it's a conspiracy to withhold information. I'm not saying it's even evil. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is I think it points out that, and I invite you to prove me wrong, but I think it points out one of the ways, one of the reasons that some conspiracies might actually be worth considering as true. In other words, Dr. Pepper wants you to believe they have the best tasting soda. They're not going to show you taste tests that might show otherwise. And Dr. Pepper is a fine tasting soda, by the way. And I'm not getting paid a cent. Dr. Pepper 10, it's the best diet drink. At any rate, when we come back, I'm going to finish the original conspiracy theory set of podcasts. And in the fourth hour, I think what's probably going to happen is I'm going to present another podcast that I did in 2011 that is not too far off from what we've been discussing. So we'll see you in a few minutes.
News in Washington, I'm Windsor Johnston. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel has delivered forceful remarks about China. Hagel says the country is a great power, but he urged Beijing to use its power responsibly.
With this power comes new and wider responsibilities as to how you use that power. How do you employ that military power?
Hagel spoke in Tokyo today, where there's concern over a territorial dispute with China over islands in the East China Sea. He also announced the U.S. will send 2 additional ballistic missile destroyers to Japan amid threats by North Korea. Hagel is expected to travel to China tomorrow. Communities in and around Fort Hood are trying to reestablish a sense of normalcy after an Army truck driver went on a shooting spree last week, killing 3 soldiers. NPR's Kirk Sigler reports grief counselors and mental health professionals have mobilized throughout the area.
Churches and other community centers on and off the Fort Hood Post are serving as gathering areas for those still coping with last week's deadly shooting. The Department of Veterans Affairs also has dispatched mobile counseling clinics for soldiers and their families in the parking lots at 2 local Walmarts. Andrea Farmer is supervising the effort for the VA's Readjustment Counseling Service.
And we're going to be here as long as the community needs us. So we don't have right now a date of closure. As long as we're needed, we're going to be here.
The mobile centers are staffed with 6 licensed clinicians throughout the day. Farmer says they've been fairly busy since they arrived in the hours after Wednesday's shooting. Kirk Sigler, NPR News, Killeen, Texas.
In eastern Ukraine, pro-Russian demonstrators took over local government buildings in 3 cities. NPR's Ari Shapiro reports activists in Donetsk broke through a police line.
The rally in Donetsk attracted more than 1,000 people, waving Russian flags and chanting, "Donetsk is a Russian city." A group of a few dozen protesters broke off from the crowd and forced their way into a regional administrative building. Video posted online shows the men standing on a balcony, arms raised high. While Western Ukraine identifies with Europe, eastern cities like Donetsk align more with Russia. Some people there say they want to follow the Crimean Peninsula, which Russia annexed from Ukraine last month. Ari Shapiro, NPR News, Kiev.
Praise from the international community is pouring into Afghanistan after yesterday's presidential election. Turnout was unexpectedly high in the face of violent threats from the Taliban. Afghanistan's interior minister says several security officials, election workers, and civilians are under arrest on charges of election fraud, but there's no indication that manipulation was widespread. Final election results will be announced in May. This is NPR News in Washington. A U.S. Navy warship has reached a stalled sailboat hundreds of miles off the Mexican coast to rescue a sick baby. 2 adults and their children were attempting to sail around the world when they issued a distress call. Coast Guard Petty Officer Barry Bina says the baby girl is heading to San Diego for medical treatment.
She was reported in stable condition. They were brought aboard, and that was after being brought aboard and had a medical screen done.
Officials say the 36-foot sailboat lost communication abilities and sent a satellite call for help on Thursday. Researchers have taken a big step, making a simple blood test that can detect lung cancer. NPR's Richard Harris reports.
Lung cancer is usually not picked up by a doctor until it has started to progress, but that could soon change. Researchers at Stanford University say they've developed a test that can pick up tiny amounts of DNA from a lung tumor in someone's blood. That test can be used to help guide treatments, and it can often pick up early-stage lung cancer in people who aren't yet feeling sick. This report in Nature Medicine is just the latest advance for a technology that may ultimately be useful to spot many different types of cancer early when they are easier to treat. Richard Harris, NPR News.
Health officials in Guinea say all passengers departing from the capital city's airport must fill out a health form and have their temperature taken. Officials say it's part of an effort to combat the spread of Ebola. The health ministry says anyone with a temperature higher than 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit will be tested for the deadly disease. I'm Windsor Johnston, NPR News in Washington.
Support for NPR comes from the...
As Kitsap County's largest maintenance provider, Team Innovative in Paulsbo provides commercial and residential maintenance to hundreds of millions of dollars of local real estate. With services including parking lot maintenance and street cleaning to landscape and design, Team Innovative is committed to using a green approach and following a strong environmental conscience. Team Innovative Services, 697-6858, or visit them online at getinnovative.net. Team Innovative Services, get serious, get innovative. The Loft at latitude 47.7 in Paulsbo is an amazing way to enjoy a night out on the town. At The Loft, they feature a full menu including fresh seafood, amazing appetizers, and tempting desserts. Plus, with Happy Hour Daily, you can enjoy great discounts on draft beer, house wines, and selected menu items. The Loft at latitude 47.7, open 7 days a week at 18779 Front Street in Paulsbo, overlooking the beautiful Paulsbo waterfront. The Loft at latitude 47.7, Paulsbo's only waterfront restaurant and bar.
I'm Elaine Terso with Elaine Terso Photography. Let me tell you why I say that I am not your average photographer. At Elaine Terso Photography, I can handle all of your photography needs, including weddings, families, and newborns. I have an in-home studio, or I am able to come to you to take photos wherever you want to be. Mention Guardian Broadcasting when you book, and I will give you a 10% discount. For more information, visit me online at ElaineTersoPhotography.com or find me on Facebook. I'm Elaine Terso with Elaine Terso Photography. Operation Love Reunited is a special project for military members offering free photography sessions before a military member deploys, when they return home, or for special family photos to be sent to those stationed far from home. At Elaine Terso Photography, we are a proud supporter of Operation Love Reunited. If you or someone you know is active in the military and would like to take part in this free service, please visit me online at ElaineTersoPhotography.com.
The Yacht Club Broiler is Silverdale's premier dining establishment and has been for over 20 years. Come experience the Yacht Club Broiler's famous happy hour with a casual and friendly atmosphere. Free Wi-Fi service is now available. The Yacht Club Broiler is open 7 days a week for lunch and dinner at 9226 Bayshore Drive in Silverdale. The Yacht Club Broiler, Silverdale's premier dining establishment.
Hey, it's Kevin with the Outlaw Radio Network. When it came time for the guys with Outlaw Radio to get our tuxes for the Habitat for Humanity of Kitsap County's Raise the Roof event, we honestly had no idea where to get them. Then we found Judy at Judy's Sewing in East Bremerton. As evidenced by the name, Judy's Sewing does tailoring, alterations, and repair. She also does tuxedo rentals starting at $69, bridal party dresses for $69, and bride's dresses starting at only $189. Plus, we also learned that at Judy's Sewing, not only does she offer military members prices that are lower than they're going to find at the Navy Exchange, she also prioritizes their orders. That means if you're in the military, your needs move right to the front of the line. It's a special touch of service you can only get from a locally based business like Judy's Sewing. Judy's Sewing at the corner of Fairgrounds Road in Central Valley in East Bremerton, right near Handy Andy's. Or call Judy at 360-662-1212. 662-1212. Judy's Sewing, a local business that's proud to support her community.
In 2008, Governor Sarah Palin came out of nowhere to stun the political world and become arguably the most exciting political figure of this generation. Hi, my name is Frank Aquila, and in 2008, I lobbied for Governor Palin to be on that presidential ticket as a chairman for Senator John McCain. I just wrote Sarah Palin Out of Nowhere, where I explain why Governor Palin is right for America. See it on Amazon or go to www.sarahpalinoutofnowhere.com.
Welcome back to hour number 2 of Field of Steve. My name is Stephen Gardner. I am the host of Field of Steve here on EdgeMediaSource.com. Also podcast later as Field of Steve, the podcast, which you can hear at fieldofsteve.com or by subscribing on iTunes to Field of Steve. And that marks probably the 6th time I've said Field of Steve in the last 29 seconds. So thank you for your patience. Welcome back. We are discussing conspiracies today. As I mentioned earlier, this pre-recorded version, this pre-recorded show is coming to you, while it's coming to you from Bremerton, I am actually in Cincinnati as we speak, assuming my flight made it all the way to Cincinnati and that there were no delays or no foul-ups. If there were, then this show is going to be kind of creepy. It was, and in fact, the music as we go into the next part of this segment, you're going to understand, you're going to feel, you're going to experience what might seem creepy to you. At any rate, this next segment was the final segment of the conspiracy theory month that I had in October 2011. I chose October. Well, October had actually kind of landed on me, as it turns out. It just worked out really well. I was doing a little freelance writing for one of those online SEOs, and I can't remember what SEO stands for, but it's one of those things where you can write stories. I don't want to say who it was. I badmouthed them plenty on the Field of Steve blog. In fact, if you want to go back and through the archives and look at around, 2011 or so, you'll see me badmouthing a company because of the way I was treated. But it wasn't like they were paying me a lot to do what I was doing anyway. The point was that I had a lot of fun writing some pieces for them, and so in that sense it was kind of cool. But I ended up getting canned. I let go from them, and it seemed like an insult because it seemed like I should have been firing them. But in the end, it ended up being one of the best things that could have ever happened to me, I'm sure. And I've since replaced that income and then some. And I've had the opportunity to relaunch the podcast, the Field of Steve show. And once again, in case you're not familiar with this particular program, I've done podcasts now since 2011. I did 24 of them in 2011, and that's what you're hearing today is a few of those episodes. They were short, and then I took a year off and decided to come back with them in 2013 with longer shows and less frequent. And now, thanks to Edge Media Source, I am doing them longer and more frequent. And it also means that I'm doing them live. And one of the reasons this was attractive to me was that I wanted to learn to be able to speak live extemporaneously, to do it well. So in the future, when I return to the happy place I know of as Kitsap County, and I stop working weekends for the Kitsap Sun, I will return to doing live podcasts, but that will also feature pre-recorded stories. I think I do that well, and I think it makes the show stronger to have those. At the same time, I will spend a lot of time speaking live and off the cuff, and we can only hope intelligently. So before I don't want to go much longer, because if I just keep talking, then we'll run out of time to run the final segment of this conspiracy theory series that, again, I did in October 2011. And I know how much you're waiting for it, how much you're lusting to hear this final piece. And one thing I got to say beforehand, and I might have said this before, I don't remember it, I can't think back that far, but this particular story has, perhaps only a little bit to do with conspiracy itself. I probably could have found something else to illustrate the point better that would have dealt more directly with conspiracy. Nonetheless, it does illustrate a point that I'm trying to make, and I will discuss that perhaps at the end of this segment before we go into the final half hour of the show. So, without any more delay, I bring you the final segment on conspiracy theory. This week I discovered that I couldn't get some of the podcast to play. There was something that was allowing everything about the podcast to load except for the audio recording itself. Well, just think about this for a moment. I alluded to this on the Field of Steve blog earlier this week. In the past 2 weeks, I've referred to conspiracy theories about mailbox dots being the sign representing who will be executed or put in concentration camps when martial law is declared, 9/11 being a government operation, and JFK being killed by the CIA or the FBI or the Mafia or LBJ. I didn't even bring up the moon landing being a fraud. In these conversations, I've been dismissive of those theories. I think they arise to suit someone's worldview. But why would my podcast suddenly be rendered silent in the middle of a month-long conversation about conspiracies? Could the silencing I'm getting be part of some broader conspiracy? Could there be hands at work keeping my voice from reaching a broader audience, making my site unpredictable, and keeping it unattractive to someone who might otherwise listen? It makes total sense to me. Seriously, it does. In fact, it makes more sense to me than this being some technical glitch. Consider this. As soon as I drew attention to it on the blog, the podcast came back. It makes sense to me that once those conspiratorial hands realized they were perhaps making more of a mess than the one they were solving, they manipulated things to give me my voice back. It makes complete sense to me. That theory responds to the part of me that understands that kind of logic and that has the faith that the problems I've been having have a logical explanation. In the end, my hunch is something else is happening, something technical that's compromising what gets presented online. The details would be so complex that I would have no way of making sense of them. So now, I'm left with the sense that something is happening that I will never, ever fully understand. And I have to be okay with that. That's why conspiracy theories are so attractive. They make sense to somebody on some level. This theory about the podcast being taken down by conspiratorial hands, that makes sense to me. When what's probably true never will. It may be more work than it's worth to know what's true. And I can live with that. In 1992, I was offered a job with a startup company that was trying to strike it rich through franchise agreements in different states. I wasn't working anywhere full-time at the time. A little more stability seemed like a good idea. So I worked there the rest of the year until the company struggled so much it could no longer afford to pay me my $15 an hour. During the last month of my time there, I became better acquainted with someone I had met before, a friend of a friend. He was starting another company and offered me the chance to play along. I agreed to do it on the condition that when the company was fully functioning, that my salary would be $3,000 a month, the 1993 equivalent of about $53,000 a year now. Working for this startup company, though, did not mean getting paid all the time. Jeff, the owner, was engaged with another partner, John, in getting startup money. The goal was to raise one level of funding of $150,000, then a second level of much more than that. I don't remember what the second level was, for a good reason. While those two were raising money, I was creating copy to be used in their presentations, and I was working on getting local publicity. The idea was innovative. At the time, President Clinton was promoting a national health care program. Included was a flexible spending account program that still exists today. You basically set aside some of your income, tax-free, to pay for medical expenses. The problem then, as it sometimes is still today, was that people had to pay the expenses and then apply for reimbursement. Jeff's idea was to create a flexible spending account debit card. It seems like a no-brainer today because so many people have that, but no one was doing that at the time. Jeff, I should say, was basically a good guy, but was slow to hand out paychecks. I accepted that because of that promised salary that was coming. During that summer, he married a woman, but problems surfaced immediately after they married. This was at a time when there were lots of cases of people claiming to unleash repressed memories under hypnosis. The memories his wife had were horrible. They didn't survive the ordeal, and the marriage was annulled. Jeff was a salesman, and that helped him in his dream of entrepreneurship. He wanted to hit it big. I can't say I ever trusted him. I liked him, but I didn't trust him. The thing was, I didn't think I had any better options, so I kept pressing forward. My proudest achievement was a lengthy news piece I helped generate on KSL television in Salt Lake City. The video of that piece became something else Jeff and John used in their presentations. One Friday, a birthday dinner had been planned at a restaurant for one of the workers there, and we all planned on going. The only issue I had was money. I knew I couldn't go unless a $30,000 investment came in. Going to dinner may not seem like much now, but I'd been living on borrowed funds a lot that year, so going to a sit-down restaurant was not usual. That $30,000 investment did come in, but Jeff never did that day. The day passed with no paycheck, and I skipped out on the dinner. By the end of 1993, the company raised its $150,000, which I thought meant going on to the next level. But Jeff disappeared. He moved on to some other entrepreneurial project. I was never sure why he abandoned the one we were doing. I would see him from time to time, but I was bitter. In 1994, he married a nice woman, a woman who had battled cancer and won. I moved away from Utah to Oregon for a year, then moved back. Occasionally I'd hear how he was doing. From all I heard, his life was going pretty well. He still hadn't hit it big, but he was engaged in something. Sometime around 2000, I was on a walk around Alpine, Utah, a quiet town south of Salt Lake City, when an SUV pulled up alongside me and stopped. I heard Jeff's voice. There he was with his wife and one of their kids. They were planning to build a home and move to Alpine. He talked about hiring me to do some writing for whatever company he was working on at the time. As bitter as I'd been, for as poorly treated as I thought I had been, it was nice to see him. I still didn't trust him. I figured I wouldn't hear from him for that writing job, and I didn't. But I still liked the guy, and I really admired his wife. I moved to Washington in late 2000 and lost touch with him, but I'd hear news here and there. In 2003, the cancer came back to his wife, and she died. I wrote a note online to Jeff inviting him to contact me. I didn't hear from him, but didn't really expect to. And until this week, it was the last I'd heard anything about Jeff. I asked a mutual friend about him from time to time, but he didn't know much of anything either. Just this week, I received a text message from my brother. He knew Jeff too. He told me Jeff had died. I asked him his source and didn't quite trust who he told me. I had looked for Jeff on Facebook and couldn't imagine why he wasn't on there. So on one level, him having died made sense. On the other hand, I couldn't believe I hadn't heard it somewhere else. I contacted that mutual friend and asked if he'd spoken to Jeff. He said it had been years. Then I told him I had heard that Jeff had died, but was trying to verify it. My friend said that no, and he sent me an obituary of a different man of the same name. But then I found Jeff's wife's obituary, and shortly after that, I found a site that showed me where Jeff was buried and the day he died in December of 2007, 4 years ago. My brother texted me and told me what he had heard. Jeff went to the doctor complaining of dizziness. 2 weeks later, he died, diagnosed with leukemia. The most stunning parts about all of this to me are two things. One is that my mutual friend didn't know, and he felt bad about that. He felt bad that he was just now finding out. The second thing was that I couldn't find an obituary on him at all. The paper where it supposedly ran, the paper I used to work for, doesn't have it online, though it has a few others from that day. I'm sad about Jeff dying, and I'm also sad about the seeming anonymity of it. As I've done a little more searching, I have found a few more traces of his life. There was a story from 2000 about the company he was working at then, another he was credited with helping found. It was a .com business during the .com boom, and one of the stories mentioned average internet users logging on 4 times a month, and it was their contention that they could get college users. The product was aimed at college kids 4 times a week. Jeff was mentioned in the story several times. He was named in a presentation called The Innovator's DNA, along with Jeff Bezos of Amazon and Herb Kelleher at Southwest Airlines. And I saw him mentioned being associated with another company in 2002. And that's about all I know, which is one of the hardest things for me to accept. I always figured I would see Jeff making it big somehow or getting in trouble in a big business kind of way. But no, he left us quietly. That isn't how life is supposed to work. But life doesn't work the way it's supposed to very often. This is why I have a hard time believing some of the major conspiracy theories we hear about, the ones about 9/11 or JFK or a fake moon landing, for those theories to have any chance of being correct, everything has to line up perfectly. And life seldom does. I think the 9/11 attackers had a plan that required a lot of luck as well as all their preparation. And it didn't go perfectly for them, though they would probably agree that it went about as well as they might have hoped. Ingrid Walker from the University of Washington, to me, was basically making that point. The conspiracy theories require tight little stories that are logical and move in perfect sequence. Life just doesn't operate that way. In doing this podcast, writing the blog, or doing my work as a reporter, I often have ideas about what might cause a stir, but I'm often surprised. And that, I believe, is as it should be. Life is full of surprises, especially the ending. And that's where I left it three years ago, giving you a surprise ending by just ending it right where it was. Because that's essentially how the story of Jeff ended for me. As you have just heard, I didn't even know that Jeff had died for months or years after it happened. It was a strange thing. It was a difficult thing to accept as well. Even though I had had reason to be bitter at Jeff and was no longer bitter at him, even though I had that reason, I was kind of sad to hear that he had gone. I think my recollection of him was I was out walking in Alpine, Utah, and he and his wife both drove up and said hello. And who knows, in that moment, there was illness eating at both of them that they didn't realize. His wife had had cancer before, and when she died, it was from a relapse. He had shown no clues. He had never shown any evidence of being ill. And so it's a shocker. And it's one of those things that makes me think right now, what's eating at me? What might be going on in my body that could be causing destruction? We just don't know. We don't know about a lot of things, what might be out there causing destruction. And my hunch is, most things that are out there causing destruction, they don't know they're doing it either. So as I said before, I believe there can be conspiracies. I believe there can be orchestrated schemes to create the kind of results that we suspect have been meant to be created. But most times, most of the schemes that we're aware of, that we get made aware of, are things we know about. We know why people do it. When people run for office, usually they tell us why they want to be in office. And now, it's not as if I'm not immune to conspiracy theory. I'm a big fan of the Netflix show House of Cards. Kevin Spacey plays a masterful manipulator who has managed to insert himself into a very powerful position. I won't spoil it for you by telling you what that is. But when the show starts, he's a member of Congress. So that's not exactly a peasant in American politics. It's a great show. I think it's I love the show. But I'm also finding myself at times laughing in disbelief that the stuff he pulls off could actually happen. I get the questions. There are incidents where I and my friends and I will sit and talk about it, and we'll say, well, there would have been another camera there. Now, he would have had to been able to suppress the view from that camera, all those kind of things. Again, my point is that in a show like The House of Cards, the story ties up so you know all the details. And in reality in life, we don't know all the details. And part of the problem that Ingrid Walker pointed out was that one of the biggest mistakes conspiracy theorists make is that they tie up all the loose ends. And seldom in life do we know where all the loose ends are. It's why Jeff could disappear and die within weeks. He didn't know all the loose ends that were going on in his body. And I just have a hard time believing that we can ever capture all of the loose ends that make conspiracies tick. When we come back, I'm going to play one more story from 2011 that deals with a corporation and not the government. So thanks for joining us. You got one more segment of Field of Steve.
Hey, sports fans, have you ever wished there was a live and local all-sports broadcasting network? Well, wish no more. It's ISBNsports.com. Kitsap's only live and local all-sports 24-hour broadcasting network, featuring the Kitsap Blue Jackets, Olympic College Rangers, high school athletics, and the ISBN Sports Show every Saturday morning from 10 to noon with interviews from exclusive guests from around the Sound. So, you want sports? Go to ISBNsports.com.
Judy's Sewing in East Bremerton is your one-stop shop for all your sewing, alteration, and clothing repair need. At Judy's Sewing, you can also find tuxedo rentals and bridal party dresses for only $69 and bride's dresses starting at $189. Judy's Sewing at the corner of Fairgrounds Road and Central Valley in East Bremerton, near Handy Andy's, or call Judy at 360-662-1212. That's right, 360-662-1212 for Judy's Sewing.
Make a difference in your community and volunteer at Kitsap Humane Society. We have opportunities for everyone and need help in all areas of the shelter. You can clean, feed, and help socialize animals, or answer phones, greet customers, and help run special events and fundraisers. KHS volunteers also lead programs including our foster program, canine training, and animal-assisted therapy. If you are interested in volunteering at Kitsap Humane Society, visit our website at kitsap-humane.org.
Ish Vintage Clothing and Costumes in Bremerton is your home for quality vintage clothing and costumes and accessories. At Ish, you can purchase the outfit of your choice, or you can rent it. Every rental comes with free accessories you need to complete the outfit, such as belts, purses, jewelry, scarves, hair accessories, and more. Come visit us at Ish Vintage Clothing and Costumes at 249 4th Street in Bremerton.
Welcome back to the final segment of Field of Steve this Wednesday, April 6th, 2014. My name is Stephen Gardner, and I'm happy to join you in helping you waste another 2 hours of a Sunday afternoon. 2 hours you'll never get back. I'd apologize, but don't say I didn't warn you. In this final half-hour segment, I'm going to present to you another story that was that I told in 2011, and it's actually a combination of a couple of stories. I take a story from my dad and relate it to something a little more modern. It's also a story that can be found in the book Spill Your Guts, which coincidentally is a book I wrote. That book is a compilation of the 24 podcasts that I did in 2011. It's a retelling of those stories in convenient book form. I think you can actually read the book and get through a chapter every time you go to the bathroom. At any rate, it's I offer the book as yeah, I'm stammering, and I'm not going to correct it because I'm going to pretend this is a live show. At any rate, it's a book that you can get by going to thenarrativearts.com or going to fieldofsteve.com and clicking on the link to the book. And you can order an autographed copy from me, and I will sign it with a very special message that I will give only to you. And when I say only give it to you, it's the same message I give to everybody, except I'll put your name on it. So you can consider it special that way. At any rate, the book is available at my website, thenarrativearts.com, or at fieldofsteve.com by clicking on the book link. Or if you go to fieldofsteve.com, you can see links to where it's available on Amazon. And I will tell you that it is going to be less expensive on Amazon. Also, I will tell you that if you order it there, you can get the Kindle version for just $1 more. So that's quite the bargain. You get the same book for the same price, and you get the Kindle version thrown along with it. Because generally the print version of the book is about $1 cheaper on Amazon than it is from my own site. At any rate, this story deals with something, a couple of incidents my father saw, once as an adult and once as a child. And it deals with the community of Libby, Montana. And if you know anything about Libby, Montana, you probably know this story, but I'm going to tell it to you anyway. Again, this was a podcast episode from 2011. One of my favorite ones, and it deals with on some level, though I didn't include it with the conspiracy podcast, it deals to some degree, in large part, with conspiracy. I don't get so overt because I had a different theme for that show. This particular show was about seeing what we want to see, but there definitely were conspiratorial forces at work. And once this episode is finished, once this story is finished, I'll come back and perhaps talk about that to round out the rest of the show. So without further ado, something I've been known to say when I do these rerun episodes, here is the final story in today's webcast.
Friedrich Nietzsche once said, "Faith means not wanting to believe what is true." I don't know what the context was, but as humans, we have a tendency to not want to believe, or to want to believe in something so much that the truth is left in the dark. Two companies I remember working for, I continued to work for because I wanted to believe things were on the up and up, until I saw so much that I had to stop believing it. So I'm guilty of it too. It has been pointed out to me, though, that the Wright brothers had to ignore the truth, that man can't fly, to invent man flying. Sometimes what we hold as true isn't true at all.
Anche stamattina un altro inutile giorno. Anche stamattina un altro inutile giorno. Non posso che stare che a pensare a levarmi intorno. L'intera casa è vuota anche il cammino. L'intera casa è vuota anche il cammino. Ho lasciato mia compagna, visitava spesso il mio vicino.
I don't have any idea what that guy is saying. I can't really say with any certainty I know what language it is. I want to believe what he's saying is appropriate for the topic, but I don't know. The music seems right. In the early 1960s, my dad was a detective with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. It meant he wore a suit instead of a uniform. The guys in uniform had already arrived to a home in El Monte, which is about 15 miles east of downtown Los Angeles. A man had decided to go into a closet in his home and end his life. His son, a man in his 20s, insisted to officers he had to see his father in his deceased state. My dad arrived and saw the remains of the man who committed suicide. It wasn't pretty. The man had taken a rifle and put the barrel of it in his mouth and fired. He was still standing up in the closet even after he died. My dad went outside to talk to the man's son to try to convince him that this was something he didn't want to see. My father had seen lots of this at this point in his career. He'd been a police officer for about a decade, first in San Marino, a wealthy LA suburb, and then with the sheriff's department. Death, often the ugliest kind, was part of the job. He could see it and continue to do whatever investigating there needed to be done. There was no reason to suspect, however, that the deceased man's son would be equally as capable of seeing a man standing up in a closet minus much of his head, especially if the man in the closet was his own father. Still, the man persisted and persisted and persisted. Eventually, the deputies relented. And after the man saw his father, he complained that deputies should never have let him see it. It's not much unlike the movie Step Brothers, when the characters played by Will Ferrell and John C. Reilly ask their parents if they can turn their beds into bunk beds. When things don't go well...
The bunk beds were a terrible idea! Why did you let us do that?
In the book Willful Blindness, Why We Ignore the Obvious at Our Peril, author Margaret Heffernan discusses the small Montana town of Libby. During the last century, vermiculite was discovered in the mountains nearby, which meant a mine would go up in the town, providing an important commodity to anyone, a job. Vermiculite was used to create things like insulation, drywall, and concrete, and Libby was providing about 90% of the U.S. material. In the early 1950s, a state health engineer found that the air in the mine had significant levels of asbestos, and he wrote that the dust would eventually create lung problems for mine employees. He kept coming back and making recommendations to the company to improve things, but the asbestos content kept rising. The workers never heard anything about it because the findings were only being shared with the mine's management. Even though more than half of the men working in the mine had had x-rays showing early signs of lung disease, they were never told. In the early 1960s, W.R. Grace bought the company and continued keeping mine employees in the dark. The amazing thing about Libby is that even after people started dying in unusual numbers of lung ailments, few wanted to believe the mine could be at fault. If you read the news accounts about the town, some people there attributed a lot of the deaths to smoking or some weather pattern that trapped the air in funny ways. There was a lawsuit in which Grace was found guilty and ordered to pay a fine, but the local newspaper didn't cover it. And what it seemed to do most was divide the town between those who still depended on the mine for a living and those who admitted they were sick because of the same mine. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer first broke the story in 1999 with reporter Andrew Schneider's piece, Uncivil Action. Schneider said people there said there was no way the mine could be creating that kind of problem, because if it were, there was no way Grace would send people in there. But Schneider was able to document how the company knew about the danger and didn't tell anyone. And with all the documentation, people still didn't want to know. They didn't want the Environmental Protection Agency's help, and they didn't want a special center for asbestos victims, because they still didn't want to admit that the company could have let so many people knowingly die. In 2000, the Agency for Toxic Substances Disease Registry issued a report showing that the death from asbestosis in Libby was 40 times higher than the rest of the state and 80 times higher than the rest of the country. The mine had as many as 150 workers at a time. The town of Libby has a population of about 3,000 residents. An estimated 400 have died with lung problems, and another 1,750 have become sick, according to an Associated Press story released just within the past week. Libby is now home to what is considered one of the biggest Superfund sites in U.S. history. According to Schneider, people who didn't work at the mine got sick too, especially the miners' family members who were exposed to the asbestos through the miners' work clothes. Hugs and kisses had become deadly. That AP story, by the way, reported that wood chips and bark that have been taken to city parks and other outdoor areas has high asbestos levels. Heffernan writes that some people are still refusing to cooperate with cleanup help offered by the EPA. So one neighbor can have the whole yard cleaned up with the EPA's help, but a neighbor refusing can mean there is still a threat. As Heffernan writes, the EPA can't stop the wind blowing. The same kind of denial, Heffernan points out, reveals itself when you talk to people about excessive sunbathing and tanning bed use, when taxes are due, when people have bad habits they know they should quit, or when the car starts making a weird noise. That last one is the one most common to me. Linking back to our story of the son who insisted on seeing his father, the obvious link seems to be a contradiction. In his case, he wanted to see something, his dead father. The deputies warned him how gruesome it was, but he insisted he knew he had a right to see it. As far as my dad can remember, the man didn't express any doubts that it was his father in that closet, but he kept arguing that it was his right to see him. You have to figure, though, he thought at least in his head the sight could be awful, but he blocked whatever message he was getting suggesting that the scene was worse than what he could handle. We can blame it on trauma and crisis that did the blinding. Crisis and trauma can have a way of obscuring logic. So what he didn't want to see was that seeing his father like that could be as painful and damaging as it did turn out to be. So much that he later told deputies he wished they'd been more forceful and keeping him away from his dad. As I mentioned before, my dad was used to seeing gruesome things by this time in his life. It shouldn't be that surprising that it took some time for him to arrive there, though. When my dad was 9, he was playing baseball with 3 other boys in a dirt lot near 50th Street in Denver. They all heard the sounds of sirens. Gloves and bats fell to the ground, because a boy was not a boy if he missed finding out as much as he could about a possibly amazing incident. Finding the end of that siren could net a good story worth telling on the schoolyard the next day or come Monday, if the mayhem was happening on the weekend. An earlier race for a bell had ended at the home of the Bonger family, known in the area as a nice family that liked to drink. One of the sons in that family was in his 30s and apparently had given up pursuing women and having a family. Instead, he found himself indulging in a dose of a recipe that helped loosen inhibitions and generated good ideas. One good idea he had was to perform a sort of experiment. In the wrong hands, it was evidence of why it would one day be necessary for TV personalities to say, "Don't try this at home." Bongers were the wrong hands. He found himself a bullet and secured it into a vise. He then found a hammer and began banging on the bullet until it did what bullets do when they're pounded on by hammers and stuck in vices. The bullet hit the young Bonger in the shoulder. Even the kids my dad hung out with were smart enough to know something like an accidental shooting was a likely possibility for someone so inclined as to wantonly test the capacity of firearms and stupidity. When the siren sounded along 50th that day, my dad was in the vacant lot playing baseball. It seemed like miles to go in the short legs my dad possessed at the time. That was overcome by the sheer energy and stamina of boyhood. At the end of their run, the kids found their story. A man the kids later learned was a Mr. Rand had dropped off his daughters at a movie theater that day and drove away in his brand new 1939 Mercury. The car had less than 100 miles on it. Mr. Rand got to an intersection and was unable to avoid a streetcar. Hitting it so hard, the commuter vehicle was cut in half. The broken dashboard showed the speedometer stuck at 60 miles per hour. Police and others at this time were perhaps less concerned about keeping people away from mayhem. If people could stay out of the way, they could sometimes get as close as they wanted. My dad, who later in life would see things far worse than this, got close enough to be across the street from Rand's car. And based on what he saw, he decided to not get any closer. He'd seen enough. Other kids at this point had descended from all over to watch over the scene as police and other emergency crews tried to save whoever could be and clean up the scene. The accident was the talk of the schoolyard until school got out for the summer. Some kids did get a closer look. One kid, a couple of years older than my dad, a boy named Harmon but known mostly as Junior, decided he would get a closer look, a decision that allowed him to see Mr. Rand's exposed brains. Junior told my dad he'd made the right choice by not getting closer. He said he wished he'd made the same choice. My dad was, in that moment, willing to accept that something in that car wasn't worth seeing. He was willing to remain blind to the details because he knew the details in this case wouldn't help him and might even hurt him. So in that sense, remaining blind was based on his willingness to see a bigger truth. Junior, like a man my dad would meet years later, was willfully blind to what kind of damage seeing something like that could do. So he blinded himself to that same bigger truth by choosing to see something that he immediately discovered was hard to handle.
So to put a final bow on this episode on this subject, which I know runs contrary to my beliefs about conspiracies, because one of the points I made earlier was that one of the biggest mistakes conspiracy theorists make is that they try to wrap up stories and provide tidy little endings or have answers to every single question, when in fact in life we seldom get the answer to every question, and that there are forces working in life that we don't know about, and most of them we probably never will know about. Nonetheless, I wanted to present that story as part of this conspiracy episode because I think it illustrates one of the points I make. And this gets to the issue that I've had trouble wrapping my arms around, and that is the issue of voter fraud. one of the reasons I have trouble with it is because I don't see how anybody really benefits from voter fraud, because you have to do enough of it to make a difference. And elections, while many are close, it seldom does cheating necessarily make the difference. Now, those on the left can argue that what happened in Florida was significant enough cheating that it gave the election to George Bush. And those on the right can argue that they have found cases. I mean, the one that gets brought up the most is the case in 1960 with Jack Kennedy beating Richard Nixon in Illinois by just enough votes to carry him to the presidency. As I believe his father famously said, "I'm paying for a victory, not a landslide." Or I probably have that quote somewhat wrong. Nonetheless, my issue with voter fraud is the cases that get brought up are of rogue individuals going in and voting for somebody who probably shouldn't be allowed to vote, either because they're a felon and somehow they got let in to vote anyway. In that case, it's just one vote. And why one person would want to commit fraud to vote is beyond me. But it isn't like there's any money in it. Where voter fraud actually happens the most is when county officials engage in it, when they can monkey with lots and lots of voting numbers. That's where real voting fraud makes a difference, because that's where it can happen enough that that somebody can benefit financially by rigging an election. What we have had in the past are voter registration fraud. There's been plenty of that, where somebody who is paid to sign people up to register as a voter starts making up names. And see, this is where I get to my point that the motivation there is obvious. Somebody's making money by making up voter registration names. Well, those phony names don't actually go and vote. Those phony names don't actually end up influencing an election. I suppose in some ways they can influence boundaries if they go undetected for a while. But I have not seen massive cases of voter fraud, not enough that it's actually ever influenced an election. This story that we told about Libby, Montana, and the Grace Company and the motivation they had to withhold the information that they had, to me, that is the obvious conspiracy, and it is the question that anyone should ask anytime. The first question you should ever ask when it comes to a conspiracy or a potential conspiracy is, who makes money from it? There are other reasons, there are other motivations. But I also think if you're a religious person, if you're a Christian person, there's a reason that in the Bible it says that money, the love of money, not money, but the love of money is the root of all evil. And now let me change the emphasis there. The love of money is the root of all evil. Somehow, if you're to interpret the scripture a particular way, any evil that you see in the world is influenced in part by money. I think I would have a hard time making that case. I think there are times when we're motivated by power, but there's also money that comes with power, and men obviously can be motivated by sex. And women too, women as well. I shouldn't just generalize and say it's men only, but there is a reason. There's that statement that women have to be in the mood, men have to be in the room. And if you don't get that, think about that for a little bit. Maybe I just need to say it a different way, and it'll make it clear. For love to happen, how about I say it this way? For love to happen, women need to be. When I say love, I should be saying sex. So for sex to happen, women need to be in the mood. Men just need to be in the room. Now, I didn't make up that joke, but I've wasted about a minute now just to explain why I said what I did. Nonetheless, money seems to be a motivator for a lot of whatever the evils might be in the world. And so the question I would tell anyone to ask when approached or confronted by a conspiracy theory is, where's the money in this? And if you can answer that question, well, maybe then you've got a reason to suspect conspiracy. And it is a lot of what it's a lot of the reason that people who argue about money in politics and about who's remaining hidden and who benefits from that, well, that's why they get some traction. It's because they can show an obvious financial benefit. So that pretty much takes care of the conspiracy episode for 2014. I don't think I'll be coming back to this subject matter during the rest of this year unless I'm compelled to do it for some other reasons. One of the things I want to bring up is something I had considered pursuing in this week's episode was a fill in the blank. Now, as you notice, I haven't presented a This Week in Crap or a fill in the blank portion of the show this week. Well, I think that This Week in Crap pretty much the entire episode could be considered to have delivered on the This Week in Crap meme. Not because it was crap. I'm quite proud of this, the 2 hours that we've spent together. And if you believe, no, I'm quite proud of the 2 hours we're spending together today, even though I'm in Cincinnati and you're in, well, I don't know where you are. You could be listening from anywhere, but I can tell you most assuredly, if you're listening to this live or even on the podcast later in the week, I'm probably in Cincinnati. At any rate, the This Week in Crap, the entire episode, I can call it the entire episode because conspiracies a lot of times deal with crap. What I didn't come back with was fill in the blank. And last week, if you'll recall, I did a fill in the blank and got no responses. And part of that is because to ask people how they would trade problems with somebody, it's just tough. This week had quite the opposite response. I did a fill in the blank, and the question essentially was, and I don't have it in front of me, but the question was, the worst song ever is, and I allowed people to weigh in. And I got more than 70 responses, some of them Christmas songs, and I eliminated those. And some of them were songs that weren't designed to be great anyway. They might have just been designed to be funny. So I eliminated those. And even with that, I still had close to 70 songs that were sent to me. And I have a few that I threw up two of my own that were two of my least favorite songs ever in life. One was Billy, Don't Be a Hero, either by Paper Lace or Bo Donaldson and the Haywoods, depending on which radio station you were listening to. The other one was a song by Terry Jacks called Seasons in the Sun. And next week, the chances are great that I am going to go over all of the songs that were suggested. I can tell you a few of the big ones were Afternoon Delight, Muskrat Love, and You're Having My Baby. But there were at least 60 to 70 more songs that were suggested as part of that. So next week, my plan for now is to talk at length about those songs, to bring clips of some of those songs, and to spend much of the 2 hours that we have together next week talking about some of the worst songs ever written and performed. And so what more could you have to look forward to than 2 hours of bad music? So once again, I thank you for joining me here on Field of Steve. As we close the show, I once again remind you that many of the stories you hear, particularly the ones you heard today, are available in the book Spill Your Guts Guts, which you can order through thenarrativearts.com or at amazon.com, or you can go to fieldofsteve.com or narrativearts.com and click on the links to Amazon, and you can buy on Amazon you can buy the book and the Kindle product for the same price that you can get the book on my website. However you want to order it, I'm going to be grateful. Thank you for listening. Thanks again to Edge Media Source. Later this week, this show will be rebroadcast as a podcast at fieldofsteve.com, and the weekly show can also be downloaded on iTunes through Field of Steve. It becomes the Field of Steve podcast, and each week I throw a tiny little bit of extra content on each show. If If you want to contact me, reach me at steven@thenarrativearts.com or come to fieldofsteve.com or find me on Facebook. Like the Field of Steve page, and I'll be happy to interact with you and post it. And I'll be posting more podcasts there as well, links to the podcast. And having a grand old time. And if you're really desperate, you can read me in thekitsapsun.com, though probably not much this week since I'm in Cincinnati. Thanks again for listening to the show, and as I will tell you always, I look forward to hearing your stories.
News in Washington, I'm Windsor Johnston. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel has delivered forceful remarks about China. Hagel says the country is a great power, but he urged Beijing to use its power responsibly.
With this power comes new and wider responsibilities as to how you use that power. How do you employ that military power?
Hagel spoke in Tokyo today, where there's concern over a territorial dispute with China over islands in the East China Sea. He also announced the U.S. will send 2 additional ballistic missile destroyers to Japan amid threats by North Korea. Hagel is expected to travel to China tomorrow. Communities in and around Fort Hood are trying to reestablish a sense of normalcy after an Army truck driver went on a shooting spree last week, killing 3 soldiers. NPR's Kirk Sigler reports grief counselors and mental health professionals have mobilized throughout the area.
Churches and other community centers on and off the Fort Hood Post are serving as gathering areas for those still coping with last week's deadly shooting. The Department of Veterans Affairs also has dispatched mobile counseling clinics for soldiers and their families in the parking lots at 2 local Walmarts. Andrea Farmer is supervising the effort for the VA's Readjustment Counseling Service.
And we're going to be here as long as the community needs us. So we don't have right now a date of closure. As long as we're needed, we're going to